Well, I've entitled this message of this morning, Staying on the Right Path. Staying on the Right Path. And this week I actually read a blog post of someone, a volunteer at a trail running race or event. And this race had different distances, ranging all from 5 kilometers all the way up to 50 kilometers. So there were a 10 kilometer in there were a 21 kilometer race. And this volunteer who helped, she helped at the 30 kilometer mark at that water station, 30 kilometers. And she was very positive that she wouldn't see any of the other runners except the 50 kilometer runners to come past the 30 kilometer station. But she actually did see some runners that were not part of the 50 kilometer race. She saw a guy from the 21 kilometer race running by and coming to the 30 kilometer mark water station. And they wondered how that could happen. And he told them that he blindly followed after another runner, not really seeing the markers along the road. He ran after this runner. He went off the right path and he ended up at the 30 kilometer water station, huffing and puffing, all because he did not stay on the right path. I'm telling us that this morning, dear friends, because I think it is quite applicable to our passage of this morning. When it comes to our walk with the Lord, there may be times when we feel tempted to deviate from the right path, to deviate from God's way, from God's path. And perhaps you're here this morning and you have done so. Perhaps you have experienced even the sad consequences of deviating from God's path. Or perhaps you may be here this morning and you sort of sense that you're not deviating from God's path, but it seems like you are flirting with a different path, a path that is not God's path. Well, if that is you this morning, then I want to say that this text here this morning will actually remind us that that is not God's way and plan for any one of us to deviate from His path. Now, God wants us to experience the fullness of life as He has intended it for us. But in order for us to experience it, we must stay on the right path. To experience the fullness of life, you must stay on the right path. Let's jump into this passage. There are three things that we will learn from this passage, three things that the author will want us to recognize from this text. And the first thing the author wants us to recognize is that there are benefits to actually staying on the right path. Now, this week, as we've seen last week, we have another set of instructions from the Father to a Son. Last week, we heard the Father making an appeal to His Son to get wisdom. However, this week we see Him appealing, in fact commanding His Son to now walk in wisdom, to live in wisdom. And one can really sense the urgency in the Father's words. This section, it starts off, as did the previous section, with a command, an imperative to the Son. Hear, my son. But there's also another command. He says, my son, don't just hear my words, accept my words. So this father really wants his son to pay attention. It sounds like a typical parent, doesn't it? I can just hear my mom saying, don't just listen, don't just hear my words, listen to my words. Don't let it go in one ear and out the other ear. The father says, hear my son, accept my words, my child. And the rest of verse 10 says or tells us why that is the case. Why should the son listen and hear to his father? Well, it says, because it will increase, you will increase in your years of life. You will increase in your years of life. To put it more simply, hear and accept my words, my child, so that it may go well with you. And isn't that every parent's desire for their child? Whether they are a child themselves or whether they have children of their own, a parent like this father desires that it would go well with their child or their children. But did you notice from our text, for that to happen, for it to go well with the child, it doesn't seem to happen automatically. No, there seems to be some form of intentionality. The father desires his son to walk in the way of wisdom, and he seems to be intentional about that. Notice verse 11. Verse 11, the father speaks and he says, I have taught you the way of wisdom, and I have caused you to tread on the path of righteousness. He's saying, my child, the reason why you are walking on the way of wisdom is not by accident. Contrary, it is because I made sure that you get on that path of wisdom. And to get this son on the path of wisdom, the father perhaps had to pray to God for his child to one day be on that path. Many prayers, perhaps, night and day. Perhaps teaching the child the way of wisdom, the father had to get his family involved in some sort of Bible reading and prayer on a daily basis. I think everyone, whether you are a parent, whether you are a guardian, or whether you're not a parent, you would agree that raising a child is hard work. Perhaps you were a hard child to raise. And so being intentional about getting our children on the right path is no easy task. And maybe you are here this morning, and you have kids, or you have grandkids, and you know that they're not in the path of wisdom yet. Well, this passage of this morning encourages us not to give up on our children. Don't give up on them. Whether they are small and stepping on your toes, or whether they may be big and stepping on your heart by what they are saying or what they are doing. Don't give up on them. Pray for them and graciously point them to God so that it may go well with them. Notice another benefit of staying on the path of wisdom. Verse 12 tells us, when you walk, your step will not be hampered, and if you run, you will not stumble. In other words, you will be kept safe. You will be kept secure on this path of wisdom. No matter what comes your way, whatever life throws at you, you will be kept safe and secure. Stay on the path, the Father says. And notice how you do that. You do so by means of verse 13, by keeping the Father's discipline or correction. He says, keep hold of instruction. Do not let go. Guard her, for she is your life. Guard the Father's wisdom. Guard his discipline like you would something precious. Guard it, for it will be life-giving to you. The Father wants his Son to recognize the benefits of wisdom. Now, this made me think of one story that made the news headlines earlier this year. They actually made this story and recreated it into a movie. And it's about four children and their mom who went aboard a plane, and sadly the plane crashed deep in the Amazon of Colombia. And we are told that the kid's mom and the pilot, unfortunately, died in the crash, leaving the four children to fend for themselves. The oldest of the four were a 13-year-old girl, and the youngest was an 11-month-old baby. Well, to make a long story short, after 40 days in the jungle, 40 days, the kids, although weak and injured, were found alive. And they asked the elders, how is it that they survived? How is it that how she could have led them through this forest? How could she take charge of them? And she said without hesitation that she could do that because of what her mom had taught her. And their mom had taught them to survive. This 13-year-old and her siblings held on to the mom's words. And although the mom was not alive anymore, her words ended up being life-giving to her children. The Father in our passage, I think, says a similar thing. Guard my words. Stay on the right path. Keep walking that road, for it will be life-giving to you. Friends, this is true of the natural relationship between a parent and a child, but it's even more true of our spiritual relationship, our relationship with God, our Heavenly Father. And if you are a Christian, then this passage of this morning is especially for you. As a Christian, you are called to stay on the Christian path. As a Christian, you know that this path will have many ups and downs. You know that this path may not be easy, as I'm sure many of you may attest to. Yet, dear Christian, we are called to stay on the right path. Solomon, as it were, says, keep on walking. Now, nowadays, many people have these watches and these step counters or pedometers on their phones, which track your amount of steps you do on a daily basis. And the more you walk, the more you are able to reach your daily target of steps. And the more you reach that daily target of steps, the more you have benefits, health benefits. Well, it's the same for the Christian. When we keep on walking on the path of wisdom, there are great benefits for us. Great benefits. And so I want to encourage you, dear Christian, to stay on the path, to keep on walking the path of wisdom. Because wisdom will lead you in your workplace. It will lead you away from that lucrative but shoddy business deal. Keep walking on the path of wisdom, because wisdom will lead you at school away from bad influences. In the home, in your relationships, wisdom will lead you to speak at the right time and to keep silent at the right time. Keep on walking, dear Christian. Stay on the right path. Follow God. The New Testament talks about keeping in step with the Spirit, or walking by the Spirit. And if we do so, if we stay on this path, on the right path, then there will be great benefits for us. But our passage also tells us that that is not the case for the one who does not stay on the right path. For the one who is not on the right path, there is danger. And the Father wants His Son to recognize this danger. Have a look at verse 14 with me. It says, "Do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not walk in the way of the evil." Now, whereas the previous verses mostly stated the words of the Father in the positive sense, here from verse 14 to 17, we have the words of the Father stated mostly within the negative. Don't do this, the Father says. Don't do that. Don't, my son. 6 times, actually, He says, don't. And 3 times in verses 14 to 17, He commands His Son to avoid the wicked way, to avoid evil. It's as if this Father is really holding up this bright neon red sign with the words danger on it, flashing danger, danger, danger. The Father does not want His Son to go on this path. In fact, the language that the Father uses here in verse 14 is almost that of a wish. It's that of a desire, of a prayer, of a plea to the Son to not go in the wicked way, to not advance on the evil way. In verse 15, He says, avoid it, deviate from it, just pass by it. Now, perhaps we can think of that in terms of going up against a Springbok front rower. If you are playing for the opposing team with the ball in your possession and you see these front rowers coming to you, then if you value your life, you would probably want to avoid them. You would want to deviate from them. You would just want to pass the ball, get it away to someone else. And that's the idea the Father has in His words here. The Father is pleading with His Son to avoid danger, to avoid the path of the wicked, because there's no safety on that path. There's no security on that path like there is on the path of wisdom. Now, dear friends, this path of wickedness, there's only danger and a real sense of restlessness. I want you to have a look with me at verse 16. Verse 16 says, "For they cannot sleep unless they have done wrong. They are robbed of sleep unless they have made someone stumble." Now, I'm no professional counselor, but that does sound like addictive behavior. There's this sort of growing craving, this insatiable desire for something more, and it doesn't seem to be quenched or satisfied. There's this hunger for more. And notice, for more of what? for more evil, more wickedness. And notice also, at the expense of who? It's at the expense of others. They are robbed of sleep unless they have made someone stumble. And the Father says that's the way of the wicked. And this wickedness and evil, he says, is as common and as normal to these individuals as bread is to a person. Have a look at verse 17. It says, "For they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence." They eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. Now, I often find myself watching these true crime documentaries. I know some of those programs are fictitious. They are sometimes scripted. However, I do think, and I think some of them are real, some of them are factual. I do think that there are really husbands and wives and co-workers, for example, who rationally consider the timing, the method, and the means of how to get away with murder. I think that's a real thing. I think people do plan and plot how they can execute their murder plans. Now, dear friends, perhaps we can say with certainty this morning that we haven't done that. That we are not like these guys in these documentaries. We can say that we can't think of a time where we stayed up all night plotting and planning the murder of someone. But perhaps we have had a desire to work really hard, making our way up the corporate ladder, burning the candle at both ends, not to provide for our families, not to better ourselves, but because we wanted to get ahead of someone, perhaps even wanting to see the downfall of someone within the company. Solomon says that's the way of the wicked. Or perhaps you are at school or varsity, and you may say with certainty, but you can't remember, other than remembering staying up late for studying. You can't remember plotting and planning the murder or the assassination of someone. But perhaps you can recall, as a student, some restless or sleepless nights when you may have thought of, desired, and craved for being the popular kid, or wanting to be accepted by others. And maybe your desire to do that and to have that has pushed you to gossip about someone, has pushed you to slander someone, whether in person or online. You know, nowadays everything can be done behind a screen, endlessly texting and posting something, attempting to hurt someone, whether that is their reputation or their emotions. Solomon says, "For they cannot sleep unless they have done wrong. They are robbed of sleep unless they have made someone stumble. For they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence." Our passage says, this is not the way of wisdom. That's the way of the wicked. Stay off that path, Solomon says, because in the end it's going to be detrimental, not only to yourself but also to others. It's foolishness to go on that path, the path of the wicked. It's being rather short-sighted. And so Solomon really, he urges us to take a step back, to put these two paths side by side, the way of wisdom and the way of the wicked, and to observe them, to recognize that getting on either one of them will lead you somewhere. Friends, we need to recognize that each path, whichever we get onto, there will be a particular destination, a particular future. I want you to have a look with me at verses 18 and 19. It says, "But the path of the righteous is like the light of dawn, which shines brighter and brighter until full day. The way of the wicked is like deep darkness. They do not know over what they stumble." The Father purposefully reminds that there are essentially only two paths, two ways in this life: the path of the righteous and the path of the wicked. And whichever path the Son chooses, he can be sure that it will lead somewhere, a particular destination, a particular future. And for the one path, the future looks bright, but for the other, it is dark. On this path, you cannot see where you are walking, and you eventually stumble over whatever is in your way, whatever comes across your path, whatever happens in your life. That's the path of the wicked. It's dark. And for the one on this path, your life may feel as if it's spiraling out of control. For the one on this path, it may feel as if your life is unraveling like a thread on a piece of cloth. Is that perhaps your life this morning, dear friend? The author tells us that's the way of the wicked. And it is foolish to go on that way. Solomon will say later in Proverbs 14 verse 12 that there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. It is foolish to think that you are on the right path when in actual fact you are not. And sadly, many people are on this path today, even though the most obvious path, the path that has all the benefits which actually increase the more you tread on that path. Although it's the obvious path to choose, many still choose not to go on that path, but to go on the path of the wicked. Jesus says in the New Testament, he calls this wicked path the broad way. And he says there are many people on that path. It's a common path. And our passage of this morning really asks of us, would you rather? Would you rather choose the path which is obvious, with its obvious benefits as you tread on it? Or would you choose the path of the wicked, the common path? And although, as we have said, the obvious path, the way of wisdom, it seems like a no-brainer. Sadly, history, and perhaps even personal experience, show us that people tend to forgo the obvious things, the obvious benefits of God, for something more common. People seem to forgo the benefits God has to offer them, and they exchange it for something instant, for something far less lasting, for something far less life-giving. We don't want the obvious benefits, we want something else, something common. Pornography, alcohol abuse, substance abuse, the approval of man. These things, they all disguise themselves as life-giving. They really overpromise, but they underdeliver at the end of the day. And humanity seems to have a tendency to fall for their sales pitch. But Solomon, he asks, would you rather? Which path are you going to choose? C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Weight of Glory, I think he says something that fits in quite nicely with what Solomon has to say here. C.S. Lewis says, we are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. He says, we are like ignorant children who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because we cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. And his conclusion, we are far too easily pleased. Friends, God offers us great benefits on the path of wisdom. The path which really is a path and a walk with God. But since the beginning of time, we have chosen to turn away from God. You would remember the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve. The obvious thing for them to do was to keep on walking with God. But they instead chose to turn away from God. For the Israelites in the Old Testament, the same thing. The obvious thing was to keep on walking with God. But instead they chose to follow after other gods. And it was the same for many of God's kings in the Old Testament, including Solomon, the one writing these very words here in Proverbs chapter 4. According to the Bible, the wisest man that has ever lived, yet he swerved from the way of wisdom. And so the question that comes to mind, or at least to my mind, is, how can anyone then experience the benefits of staying on this right path when human history and personal experience show that we have a tendency to go on the wrong path? How can we experience the benefits when all the odds, as it were, are stacked against us? Well, I need not remind you, dear friends, that history also tells us and shows us that there was someone who always stayed on the right path. But although he stayed on the right path, although he always walked with God, he was nevertheless in the end forsaken by God, experiencing the consequences of treading the wicked path. And this not because he turned away from God, not because he went on the wicked path, but because you and I did, and we continually to do so on a daily basis. Friends, I'm talking about Jesus. And the sad thing is that Jesus dying on the cross, it shows us that he suffered the consequences for walking on the path of the wicked on our behalf. But the good news is he did this so that you and I don't have to suffer those consequences when we believe in him. Jesus always stayed on the right path. And in doing so, he secured for us all the benefits and all the blessings from God, our Heavenly Father. And we can receive these blessings, all of these benefits that Jesus has secured for us. Anyone can receive it, no matter what your circumstances are, no matter what your background is. Anyone can receive these blessings when they believe in Jesus. The only way to get on the right path, dear friends, the only way to stay on the right path is through Jesus. Or maybe what I've said just now does not make much sense. Can I ask you to not take my word then, but listen to what Jesus says, or what he said himself about himself. John chapter 14 verse 6 says, I am the way and the truth and the life. Jesus says, I am the way. Friends, this means that no self-help books, no self-help podcasts, no amount of self-will will get us on the path or keep us on the right path. It's only through Jesus. Only through Jesus that we can experience the fullness of life as God has intended it for us, because he stayed on the right path. Friends, this morning we've seen the benefits of staying on the right path. We've seen the dangers of not staying on the right path. But most importantly, I trust that we have seen Jesus this morning. And in light of all this, I'd like to leave us with a question to ponder this morning. And the question is, which path are you on? Or perhaps more specifically, are you on the right path? Let's pray.